I love pampas grass. I think it's so beautiful. This time of year, every sanctuary that I've led worship in, our ministers' retreats, I just want to fill with pampas grass. It's got that light and air. It feels like spirit is there. And the only problem is that pampas grass is evil. That's such a one small problem. So, for those of you who might have been concerned, great care was taken in transporting this pampas grass to this room today. No little seeds were scattered, or at least as few as we could manage. Pampas grass, French broom, Scotch broom, I hear are constant threats on our hillside here. Egg leaf spurge. The noxious plant that doesn't provide any nutritional value to any of the species around it here. I don't know if you, like me, have lived most of your life oblivious to the great evils of invasive species all around us. But if you'd like to no longer be oblivious, read Doug Tallamy's Nature's Best Hope. You know, these invasive species, they are the result of life moving with humans alongside our migrations around the world faster than ecosystems' natural ability to adapt, to cope with change. An early example, 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, I understand, wild boars were brought in Sicily and shrews in Cyprus. There have been problems ever since. But as then the engine of modernity sped up human migration, invasive species began to wreak havoc around the world at a rate never before seen. Foreign plants forcing out native wildlife just as colonizers decimated native populations and dismantled their cultures. And how quickly these foreign invaders feel like natural inhabitants. Michelle, the other day when we were talking about this service, talked about what would the Bay Area be without eucalyptus trees? Or earthworms and honeybees, neither of which native to this continent. This process of invasion, it laces itself through our lives, right? We all invade one another one way or another. In our workplaces, in our families, perhaps especially with those closest to us. And at the largest scale, this human phenomenon of invading is what we call empire. And it takes many forms, but empire, generally speaking, follows the logic of monoculture. The same logic of the egg leaf spurge that just wants to have one thing take on over. And it does this in a variety of different ways. This is what James Baldwin was talking about when he wrote The Price of the Ticket. Anybody read that essay? He's imagining, how did racism come to exist in America the way that it does? Because he's noticing that while white privilege does provide all these material advantages, these increased accesses to safety and comfort, it does so at a cost. The cost in vicious harm and vivid horror that is borne by the global majority, by people of color, is reflected in also a cost to white folks' integrity, to our moral and spiritual wholeness. And near the end of that essay, Baldwin says, go back to where you started. or as far back as you can. Examine all of it, travel your road again, and tell the truth about it. Sing or shout or testify or keep it to yourself, but know whence you came. But know whence you came. His idea is that this construction of whiteness that we have inherited, it relies on a cultural amnesia, a forgetting of traditional practices, of the ways of being together, of ritual and food and music, an erasure of culture. Wave after wave of immigrant had to learn to become white. And later, Baldwin writes, later in the midnight hour, the missing identity aches. The price the white American paid for his ticket was to become white. This incredibly limited, not to say dim-witted ambition has choked many to death here. This invasive species logic of whiteness. But we find that same logic in our economic system. Back in the early to mid-20th century, there was a group of thinkers in Germany. Many of them, they called themselves neo-Marxists. They were known as the Frankfurt School. And one influential among them was Herbert Marcuse, who warned of what he called the commodification of desire. So as the power of advertising was beginning to come clear, this was that Mad Men era of advertising, that his observation was that no longer was it even the means to satisfy human desires that were being bought and sold in the marketplace, but the creation and shape of those desires themselves. Right? And this was quite a while ago. It's gotten a lot worse since. How many of you can remember a jingle or an image from television ads when you were a kid? You still, oh yeah, basically all of us. You still wake up sometimes with that, I don't know, Eggo waffles. That was my childhood. What we want, the images in our minds of happiness and satisfaction, these are commodities that ad makers have been paid to build in us from an early age. And now, of course, human attention, we're going to talk a lot about this. We're going to have a whole worship series talking about it in the new year. But human attention, it's one of the most valuable resources out there. And so the technology to buy and sell and manipulate our attention, it's getting sophisticated way beyond anything I understand. And the impact on our souls, on our psyches, on human culture, it can't be overstated. I'm terrified of the commodification of attention like I'm terrified of climate change and war. And I know that we all are living already daily with its effect on our inner lives. I remember when Henry was an infant, we were doing that babbling back and forth together one day on the bed, that babbling that you do with infants, where there are no words, but there's so much connection and eye contact and this incredible being coming to life before me. And after a minute or so, I was horrified to discover that his attention span was longer than mine. As I grabbed for my phone. And it was a wake-up call, but it's been a struggle ongoing, how to resist this brilliantly crafted invasion into our inner lives. So those Hebrew prophets we were talking about last week, they would notice these things, and they'd say when the people had been seduced or oppressed into colluding with empire, and they would call the people back into covenant with each other, with the earth, with God. Jeremiah was one of them. It was the Babylonian Empire had conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple in 586, and what he noticed was that there was a vulnerability in the people to the empire because their practices, their ways of being had been undermined. Their spiritual depths were not protecting them from the forces of empire. And he called them with that, they were not, it was not a compassionate communication or nonviolent communication, the prophets. He was saying, you've been worshiping other gods, neglecting justice, breaking your covenant with Yahweh. This is what has made you vulnerable to foreign domination. And the new covenant that Jeremiah heard God speaking to him was to have a covenant written on the heart, not the laws of Moses, but a covenant that would be kept in the heart no matter where the people went. And I think it's true that tending to our spiritual lives, that inner acre, it can be like weeding the invasive species that are planted among us and nurturing at our heart a covenant that goes deeper than words, nurturing what naturally belongs. And here I've got a crackpot theory for you. I'm going to take a bit of a leap, and so I want to tell you why I'm taking this leap, because I'm always wondering, thinking about if our inner lives and our bigger world machinations, the political systems around us, are all part of the same human system, part of this same ecosystem affecting one another. How might that be? What would make that make sense? And so what I've been thinking about is all these folks who have been convinced that the suffering in their lives is because of foreign invaders, immigrants, coming to our country and taking their jobs. A colleague, Sherry Hostetter, talks about how people believe in conspiracy theories because there is a conspiracy out there to exploit our labor, our lives, our time, and our attention. There is a conspiracy. People are oppressed by this economic system. People are invaded in their most sacred inner beings. It's just some people have been taught to focus that pain of the invasion outward at immigrants crossing a border. We are a nation whose borders have been invaded, but it's our personal boundaries, the borders inside, the sanctity of our inner lives ravaged by the logic of an empire, an economic system that has relentlessly marketed to us, that has discovered that we are not just the consumers, but have even more value to exploit as commodities. Our attention, our desires, a natural resource to be shaped and harnessed for an unsustainable, I would even say cancerous form of growth. How will we live in a time like this? We'll talk more about Doug Tallamy's vision next week. He sees us creating homegrown national forest, national park, backyard to backyard, church campus to university to hospital, removing those invasive species and making room for native habitats. Zimmy Forrest is a basket weaver. She's in Australia, and she's built a business now weaving caskets. She weaves them out of the cat's claw vine, this incredibly invasive vine that tears down native trees, ruins native ecosystems. She's removing it, weaving it casket by casket into a ritual use for burying this colonization, this modernity that we've inherited. Robin Kimmerer wrote that beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Tells the story of Nanaposo, the first man, this Ojibwe legend of the very first man who was told and who knew that when he came to this place, this Turtle Island, that he was an immigrant. And that his job was first to get to know each plant and animal here, to walk in a way that each step is a greeting to Mother Earth. Kimmerer writes this. She says, after all these generations since Columbus, some of the wisest of native elders still puzzle over the people who came to our shores. They look at the toll on the land and they say, the problem with these new people is that they don't have both feet on the shore. One is still on the boat. They don't seem to know whether they're staying or not. She says this same observation is heard from some contemporary scholars who see in the social pathologies and relentlessly materialist culture the fruit of homelessness, a rootless past giving birth to the fruit of homelessness. And then she says this. She says, America has been called the home of second chances. For the sake of peoples and the land, the urgent work of the second man may be to set aside the ways of the colonist and become indigenous to place. But can Americans, as a nation of immigrants, learn to live here as if we were staying, with both feet on the shore? May it be so, and amen.